All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for the kind introduction and thank you to the invitation to such an important conference. It's an honor to speak with you today on the anniversary of October 7th. I'm humbled to be among experts from around the world and from various industries to discuss the current terrorism landscape while reaffirming the importance of integrated partnerships. Before we jump into the discussion today, let me first offer a bit of background about my role and the work the FBI is doing to combat the national security threats facing the U.S. and our allies. As the Executive Assistant Director for the National Security Branch of the FBI, I have the distinct privilege of leading thousands of agents, analysts, and professional staff who combat the most complex U.S. national security threats on a daily basis. I know this has been said by FBI Director Wray, but it bears repeating. The current threat to U.S. national security is at an all-time high. As I continue to meet with our international partners, I know this assessment is shared around the world. The threats range from forced terrorist organizations calling their followers to action, to racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, and anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists conducting violence to express their ideological views, to Iran's lethal plotting of U.S. officials and their willingness to conduct attacks on U.S. soil, and finally, to China and Russia increasing their brazen attempts to disrupt our democratic process. This is just a sampling of the threats we are seeing. And most concerning, they are all occurring simultaneously. But today, we draw focus back to the global impact of the terrorism threat and how no one country can fight it alone. On October 7th, 2023, I was at home watching the coverage of the Hamas attacks on the news, and my heart sank. It was a feeling I had only felt once before, on the morning of September 11th, 2001. The same hopeless devastation came over me as I watched images of innocent civilians brutalized by senseless violence. Having lived through a similar moment 22 years ago, I recognized what this attack would mean for the world. In real time, we were witnessing another turning point in the tides in the war on terror, and the impact would reverberate across the globe. In the U.S., almost immediately, there was a dramatic shift in the actions of foreign terrorist organizations. Each group, galvanized by Hamas's violence, began calling their followers to action, encouraging attack plots against the U.S. and our allies. But nothing compares to what you all were experiencing on the ground here in Israel. The Hamas attacks were the deadliest terrorist attacks in Israel's history, as Hamas conducted an all-out assault on your sovereignty, unleashing a wave of murder across the southern part of the nation. The violence was purposeful, indiscriminate, and left an indelible mark on the world, reminding us all that the terrorism threat environment persists. The brutality of that day cannot be overstated. We saw images and heard stories of horrendous acts of violence perpetrated against innocent civilians trying to live their normal lives. Women were sexually mutilated. Children were exposed to more drama than anyone should endure. Concert goers were brutally murdered, and soldiers paid the ultimate sacrifice protecting their country. 1,200 people lost their lives, and more than 200 were dragged away as hostages, with almost 100 still held captive today. The U.S. shares in the loss, with 40 Americans murdered and 8 Americans taken hostage or still unaccounted for. Once again, we saw a terrorist attack become an ominous signal to the world that we must stay focused on the terrorism threat. For the past 23 years, the U.S. has reinvented and fine-tuned our approach to counterterrorism, operations to defeat these violent actors. And it's attacks like these that remind us of the importance of remaining steadfast in our efforts to ensure our commitment to our partners. We are more determined than ever to seek justice for the victims, survivors, and their families. The U.S. stands in solidarity with Israel. And while I'm here for the next couple of days, I will be meeting with many of my Israeli counterparts to discuss how we can continue our partnership to combat the terrorism threat around the world. The U.S. is committed to doing what we can to assist Israel. And just last month, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Hamas's top leadership and charged those responsible for planning, supporting, and perpetrating Hamas's attack. The indictment is only one example of our effort to target every aspect of Hamas's operations. Make no mistake, Hamas leaders will continue to pay for these crimes. Now I want to take a few minutes to share how the U.S. currently assesses the terrorism threat. Protecting the American people from terrorism, both international and domestic, remains the FBI's #1 priority, despite a rising need for us to be vigilant against cyber attacks, counterintelligence threats, and increasing rates of violent crime within our borders. As you will continue to hear me say, the threat from terrorism is as persistent and complex as ever. Perhaps for the first time, and I'm sure many of you in the audience can relate, the FBI's counterterrorism operational tempo has remained simultaneously elevated on all three fronts: international terrorism, domestic terrorism, and state-sponsored terrorism. We as the FBI and the U.S. government continue to have our work cut out for us in countering the pervasive threat from terrorism on all fronts. As I've already stated, the attacks from a year ago are having a lasting effect, which has led to a heightened risk of potential violence from a variety of threat actors in the United States and throughout the world. Most notably, for the first time, we are seeing all major international terrorism groups, to include ISIS, Al-Qaeda, AQAP, Al-Shabaab, the government of Iran, release propaganda statements encouraging attacks against Western targets and supporters of Israel. Even propaganda statements among domestic terrorism actors have referenced October 7th, which has become a unifying rallying cry. We are continuing to see lone actors or small cells of individuals who typically radicalize online use easily accessible weapons to attack soft targets. And there is a particularly concerning uptick in the radicalization of our nation's young people. Juveniles have become a target demographic for extremist rhetoric, propaganda, and recruitment on social media, gaming, and other online platforms, which presents the government with real investigative challenges. And our caseload is not diminished, as we are currently working approximately 3,500 international terrorism cases and approximately 2,700 investigations in our domestic terrorism program. In the IT realm, ISIS continues to pose a threat to U.S. interests with their ability and desire to direct, enable, inspire attacks inside the United States. Similarly, Al-Qaeda and its global affiliates remain committed to attacking the U.S. and Western interests domestically and abroad. We also remain concerned about terrorists seeking to exploit our borders. And over the past 5 years, we've certainly seen an increase in the number of known or suspected terrorists attempting to cross the border into the United States. Recently, we coordinated with our partners at the Department of Homeland Security to conduct immigration-related arrests of several ISIS-linked individuals who pose a potential national security threat inside the United States. However, we are not just facing threats from overseas. We are also concerned about the domestic terrorism threat. Over the past several years, the FBI worked very hard to combat the increased threat posed by domestic violent extremists. Those people who may be motivated to commit violence and other criminal acts to further social or ideological goals stemming from domestic influences. The FBI's dual mission to protect the American people and to uphold the Constitution requires a high threshold be met in order to investigate hateful or angry rhetoric. This remains a top priority for the U.S. as we head into our next presidential election cycle. We cannot allow another January 6th to happen again, and therefore we must remain focused on protecting Americans' right to vote while safeguarding them from violent extremists who may seek to disrupt our democratic process. We are also tremendously concerned with the threat posed by racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. Just 2 years ago, we saw this threat exemplified in the horrible murder of 10 black individuals at the Tops grocery store in Buffalo, New York, at the hands of an individual motivated by racist hate. And just last year, the Department of Justice secured the death penalty for Robert Bowers, the individual who murdered 11 congregants at the Tree of Life Synagogue in furtherance of his anti-Semitic hate. These RIMVs pose a consistent threat of lethal and non-lethal violence against vulnerable communities. And finally, one terrorism threat that I must highlight today is the increasingly brazen actions from the government of Iran and their proxies. Without question, Iran is a puppet master supporting Hamas and many other proxies, and they have no qualms about strategically sponsoring violence and terrorist acts through the IRGC Quds Force, who conducts external terrorism operations and supports terrorist groups on behalf of the Iranian government. Organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other regional militant and terrorist groups benefit from Iran's funding, weapons, and technical training because they recognize their success in the terrorism space hinges on Iran's backing. Iran uses Hezbollah and Hamas to attack the very existence of Israel and further targets the U.S. and Western interests by using proxies or militia groups. Iran's propensity for violence knows no bounds. And from the U.S. perspective, they continue to plot attacks against former U.S. government officials in retaliation for the death of IRGC Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani. There have been several examples of Iran's intentions to carry out lethal plots in the United States. For one, the IRGC Quds Force officer targeted former National Security Advisor John Bolton by attempting to hire someone to conduct his murder. Then there were two separate plots against an Iranian dissident who consistently speaks out against the regime's human rights abuses. The first resulted in 4 Iranian nationals being charged for conspiring to kidnap the dissident. And the second resulted in 3 members of an Eastern European criminal organization being charged for plotting the murder of this same dissident. And just 2 months ago, we arrested and charged a Pakistani national with close ties to Iran who was conducting a murder-for-hire scheme and terrorism plot to assassinate a politician or former U.S. government official on U.S. soil. Now, this isn't to say we don't see the impact of the threat emanating from nation states who wish to win the great power competition. China and Russia constantly seek opportunities to undermine our way of life and to sow discord in our society. However, we cannot and will not lose sight of the terrorism threat. We remain dedicated to working with our international partners to continue disrupting these threats. The work we do is sometimes disheartening. We witness the worst the world has to offer, and it's often easy to feel bogged down by the constant threats we are facing. But on the dark days, I find strength in the resiliency of the victims and survivors we all serve. I recently had the humbling experience of meeting with some of the families of the Americans taken hostage by Hamas. I was inspired by the courage of these families. as they shared with me the stories of their loved ones. For me, it was an incredibly powerful experience to hear firsthand accounts of what the attacks meant to them. I was honored to be trusted with their stories, and I carry them with me every day. To share another example, I recently attended a conference with the FBI's Counter-Terrorism Division, where the focus of the engagement was to hear stories from survivors of various terrorist attacks from around the world. There was a panel discussion with the rabbi and chief of police from Colleyville, Texas, and our former Dallas special agent in charge, where they shared the harrowing details of how an armed terrorist held the congregation of Beth Israel hostage because of his violent, ideological-driven beliefs against the Jewish faith and its people. The rabbi shared a story of strength and heroism on the part of the congregants who maintained their composure throughout negotiations. Ultimately, the congregants were able to fight off their captor and bravely escape. The chief and former Dallas SAC addressed the key components of an integrated law enforcement response and the importance of real-time information sharing when mitigating a threat. All panelists reminded the audience how a routine prayer service can quickly turn into a nightmare situation. The incredible feat accomplished by the congregants that day cannot be overstated. The rabbi's actions saved lives, and he is a true testament to the power and resiliency of survivors. These are the heroes that motivate me to do the work I do every single day. To conclude, I want to bring it back to why we were all here today. The attacks of October 7th. It was another benchmark tragedy that ultimately changed the trajectory of the terrorism threat. And the impact is something we all will continue to deal with. We cannot forget the names of the people who were taken far too soon. We must not forget the sacrifice of the soldiers and the everyday heroes who stood up to this brutality. And we will not lose our sense of urgency to always protect our way of life. No one nation can defeat adversaries we are up against. Everyone in this room can play a part. This is a fight that demands partnership and collaboration between governments and at every single level. Although the threat continues to evolve, challenging us in new ways, the FBI's resolve to disrupt and defeat terrorism is unchanged. We seek justice in all that we do, and we commit to holding the guilty accountable, no matter how long it takes. Together, we can confront challenges before us and adapt the new challenges that arise. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Appreciate it.